As you know, this week, Dan Rather, who at the end of the presidential campaign of 2004 went AWOL in the midst of doing a story on George Bush. He's now come out of hiding in 2007 to shoot the lame duck called George. Yeah, guys, if you remember, and how could anyone forget that back in September 8th of 2004, and I'm sure you marked it on in your calendars, Dan Rather ran a story that, believe it or not, Daddy Bush made a phone call in 1968 during the war in Vietnam to get Baby Bush out of the war and into the Top Gun job in the Texas Air National Guard. Now, it was a heck of an accusation to say that. I mean, what he's basically saying is that our president of the United States is a yellow belly, cowardly, draft-dodging, little privileged scumbag. What a terrible thing to say about our commander in Mission Impossible chief. BBC ran the story a year before Dan Rather. Greg Palast was the reporter. And I have to tell you that BBC has never retracted one word, one comma of our accusation that the fix was in for George. And we had the documentation. I even had the guy who made the phone call and did the fix. And we've never backed down by 1 inch. But what happened? CBS backed down. CBS backed down. In fact, I'm reading, I have a lawsuit filed by one Mr. Rather from last week in which he says that Sumner Redstone, who's the CEO of Viacom, okay, he is reported to have become enraged that the broadcast about the fix being put in for little George had hurt CBS in the eyes of the Bush administration and exclaimed that Mr. Rather and anyone associated with him must go. And the first guy to agree with him was Dan Rather. Because if you read this lawsuit, and see, a lot of people I know, I think that Dan, he's such a hero. He's finally come out in 2007. In 2004, when the presidency was in the balance, Bush was powerful, but on the edge of losing his cushy little seat at 1600 Pennsylvania to a guy who actually went to the war, Mr. Kerry, that Rather, in those months, hid. We noticed he didn't stand up for his story, while CBS actually said that Dan Rather ignored the evidence that the fix was not in for George. He got it by taking a test. By the way, he did take a test, just so you know, and I know this. He was in the 26th percentile out of 100. That makes him 1 point above too dumb to fly. Okay? But he got over thousands of other kids got the Top Gun job. Okay. Now, I was wondering what this evidence was that proved my story wrong, the one that Rather repeated about the Texas Air, George getting the fix in for the Texas Air Guard. So I went to Leslie Moonves, the president of the president of CBS, and I said, Leslie, I don't want to ignore this evidence. This is true. Give me the evidence, and I'll retract my story. In fact, I'll make it easy for you. I'll give you $100,000 if you give me that evidence. I never got it, so he didn't know that the check would have bounced. It was only $72.26 in the checking account, but that didn't matter. I didn't expect him to pick up something that he doesn't even bother tipping his chauffeur with. But what did Rather do? I went out and defended the story because, after all, it's my story. But what about Dan? Dan was AWOL. You couldn't find him anywhere. We marched up and down Black Rock, the frightening name of the chief inquisitors at their headquarters of CBS, and couldn't find Dan. We tried. We hunted everywhere, but we couldn't find him. And now in his lawsuit, which is, I ask everyone to read this, because what it is, it's not so much a lawsuit document as it is a confession. He says he refrained from defending his reputation. He refrained from defending the broadcast. He refused to disavow statements by the station which he knew was absolutely false. He knew the story was completely true. It says so right in here. But he agreed to be silent. Why? Because he's a man for all seasons. He begged for some extra airtime on 60 Minutes and an extension of his contract, and they said, yeah, Danny, we'll give you you keep your little lips shut. You don't move those lips. in public, and we'll extend your contract, Dan, and you can also report on 60 Minutes again, like when you were a kid, okay? And Dan went for it. Here's the problem. So here's why he's suing. He's saying these snakes didn't live up to their tawdry little deal with me. I shut up. And the day after, literally, according to the lawsuit, the day after Bush was reelected, they canned his behind. Well, Dan, let me explain something about snakes. When you make a deal with snakes, they sometimes don't come through. That's the thing about snakes, Dan. And the other thing about snakes, Dan, is that when you get in bed with snakes, you often just wake up slimed. I don't make deals with snakes. Okay, Dan. And so what he's doing is he wants $70 million because the snakes didn't live up to the deal. Okay, I agree. Now I want $70 million from Dan for the rest of us, for investigative reporting, to do stories that he wouldn't do. Okay, so for a shameful few minutes of airtime on 60 Minutes, he sold out this nation. Thanks, Dan. A big salute to you and George. And now what? Anyway, Richard, I know you disagree with me. You think that Dan is a hero. You've been saluting him all day.
The reason that I so wanted a show on Air America is because we are not controlled by Viacom. We're not controlled by GE or the Walt Disney Company. And Dan was in a company that didn't allow him to speak his mind. That is one of the fundamental problems with our democracy. We need to fix that.
Yeah, but he crawled. And see, it's much better to be shot standing up than crawling on the ground, Dan. I can tell you that.
Do you not want him to win his lawsuit?
No, I don't want him to win his. No, the lawsuit, because his lawsuit is saying that they didn't come up with the deal. So he said that the problem was not that CBS lied and defrauded the American public by withdrawing a story that was absolutely stone cold true, and the public interest was destroyed. He's saying they didn't live up to the deal. He wanted time on 60 Minutes. Ugh. Oh, boy, you got to read this Dan Rather lawsuit, okay? The purpose of this attack, says Dan's lawyers, the purpose of the attack on him was to deter CBS News from reporting news in a manner unfavorable to the Bush administration. My. And in the process, to diminish the credibility and career of Mr. Rather, whom they considered to be an opponent of the Bush administration. Mr. Rather complied with CBS requests throughout the almost 2-year period between the broadcast on the air guard and his departure, during which time Mr. Rather refrained from defending his story. Icky. The problem of Dan's lawsuit is it's all about Dan. So the guy goes 3 years hiding. Imagine if Dan had stood up in front of BlackRock here in New York City and said, they want to silence me. They want to suck on the president's reputation. They want to burnish this cowardly dog of a war hero. And I'm not going along with it because the story we have is dead stone cold true. Because Greg Palast told me it was true. Okay, I mean, it's true. Okay, and we're standing by it. And if they won't let me do it on the air, I'm just going to get up here on top of this trash can in front of BlackRock and tell you the story. That's what I'm going to do. And you know what? He'd be a hero today instead of a zero. You got great reporters out there. They just don't have a space to do their story. And there's also a great reporter called Dan Rather, who's locked inside this news celebrity, okay, who's fighting to get out all the time.
How do we turn that around? How do we bring that inner, awaken the inner investigative reporter?
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted Dan to do, is to rip off the outer shell celebrity outfit and say, hi, this is Dan Rather reporting, whether Redstone likes it or not, whether Viacom likes it or not. I'm reporting it anyway. And yeah, I'm losing my job. I'll see you next week on Richard Green's Clout.
He already said that he wants to speak with you.
Yes.
And maybe the next time we hear from Dan Rather, he will be speaking in a whole different way as a result of what you've said to him.
He said on my British show, if I tell the truth, I will be lynched. I will lose my job, and that's exactly
but he has no
what
job
happens.
to lose. He's on HDNet. He's in good shape.
He's in Siberia.
Greg, thanks so much for sitting in, as you do every single week on the Palast Report, and we can't wait to see what you've got for us next week.
I can't either.